Hi, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. Thank you for joining us. Many of you out there in the audience probably know Paul Tough best as the author of his last book, which is How Children Succeed. And you argued in that book, Paul, that so-called character strengths, such as perseverance and motivation and grit, may be even more important than cognitive skills like IQ in terms of helping children thrive in the classroom and beyond. And now you're out with a new book and also an article adapted from it in the magazine called How Kids Really Succeed. What does that really stand for?
So after my last book, How Children Succeed, came out, I had the experience of speaking to different groups of people. And when I would talk to groups of teachers who are working specifically with low-income kids, I would often get this question, now that we know that these skills are important, what do we actually do to develop them? The evidence is really clear that things like grit, curiosity, conscientiousness, self-control, that they matter a great deal in children's success. But what I realized after that book came out is that what we don't know a lot about is how those skills are developed. And I think a lot of teachers, when they heard this research about the importance of these skills, their instinct, understandably, was to try to teach them the way that we teach regular academic subjects, the way we teach reading or math or anything else. And what the evidence suggests that I put together in this new book, Helping Children Succeed, is that that approach doesn't work. And that, in fact, these qualities, whether we call them skills or not, are much more the product of children's environment, both in the home and in school. And so that if we want to help kids develop these skills, and we should, we need to think about how to change their environment, both at home and at school, in order to help those skills develop.
Right. I want to focus on that idea, which is the premise, I think, both for the question of how we help kids succeed and also for your book, which is that character, in the way that you describe it, is not something that we're born with, but rather that it's something that we learn, maybe not through traditional teaching, but it is something that is sort of determined through our environment. So could you talk a little bit about the evidence that environment matters, and in particular the importance of the school environment?
Sure. So I think one of the complications of talking about this whole realm is that a lot of the words that we use, things like character and grit, they really have this kind of moral valence. Right. And part of what I think is most valuable in the new research that I read about is the suggestion that these are really, not sort of inherent traits. None of us are just always perseverant or always gritty, that we tend to persevere when we're in a certain environment that encourages us to persevere. And that teachers, in a school setting, teachers can do a lot to change those environments to make it easier for kids to persevere and to make it more likely that they're going to persevere. And that is done through the messages and mindsets that kids develop from their classroom. So the things that teachers say to students, but also just the way that classrooms are organized, the way that homework is assigned, things like discipline policies. The evidence is increasingly clear that those are the things that change the way kids think of themselves in the classroom, and that changes students' likelihood of persevering through obstacles.
Right. So I want to talk a little bit about what you found through your reporting that teachers can do to really create these environments for children to develop character strengths. And in particular, I want to start with the idea of motivation. You make a pretty bold argument in your book that behaviorism, as we traditionally understand it, doesn't really work that well in the classroom, that rewards don't turn out to be that much of an incentive for kids performing well, and that punishment, too, doesn't seem to work. So how do you create an environment that motivates kids to want to actually apply these strengths?
Great question. So I'm going to go back and talk a little bit about some of the evidence that I was surprised by as well. I mean, I think this idea of like behaviorism, positive and negative reinforcement as the best way to shape kids' behavior, especially kids who are growing up in adversity, is something that is taken so much for granted in our schools that we don't even think about it. But certainly a lot of the research about discipline, about sort of the zero-tolerance discipline policies that have been in place in a lot of our public schools over the past 20 years, and how ineffective they've been at sort of creating long-term success in students. And there's a series of experiments I read about by a Harvard economist, Roland Fryer, who over the past decade has been testing out different incentive programs in public school systems all over the country. And in almost every case, getting no impact. So when he'll pay students for reading books or for getting higher grades or parents for showing up at PTA meetings, it has no effect on kids' eventual outcomes. And so the motivational inputs that seem to matter more have to do, so I draw on the work of these two psychologists, DC and Ryan, who have a theory called self-determination theory. And what they talk about is intrinsic motivation. And for them, intrinsic motivation comes down to three big feelings that kids can have, or that any of us can have: a sense of belonging, a sense of competence, and a sense of autonomy. And that when children feel those intrinsic motivating forces in the classroom, they're going to be much more likely to persevere and to work hard. And so the question for teachers is, what do we do to develop those qualities? And one of the things you notice when you look at the way that a lot of schools are run, and especially schools that have a high concentration of kids who are growing up in difficult circumstances, we don't focus on any of those things. So much of what happens at school in terms of the kind of work we assign, the way we discipline kids, it doesn't make them feel a sense of belonging. It doesn't make them feel a sense of autonomy. In fact, we tend to push more toward control the more that kids are, misbehaving.
Right. And you talk a little bit in your article and the book about zero tolerance policies and how this idea of suspending kids when they misbehave can actually backfire when you look at kids who come from disadvantaged backgrounds and may not actually have the same level of development in these key areas. Can you talk a little bit about the research behind that?
Sure. So one of the things that I draw on, and that the educators who I write about in this book are drawing on, is research in neurobiology. As education research has sort of stumbled along trying to figure out different things about what works in the classroom, neurobiologists over the past decade or two have discovered remarkable things about how children's brains and their psychologies are shaped in the early years. And one of the main things they've discovered is that when kids are growing up in really difficult circumstances, it changes their stress response system. It activates their fight or flight response. It makes them highly vigilant, highly wary of others. These adaptations make sense if you're living in a dangerous environment full of threats, but they don't make any sense if you are in school. And so one of the reasons I think that kids who grow up in poverty or other forms of adversity often struggle in school is that they walk into the first day of kindergarten with, on high alert for all provocations, and so they're much more likely to talk back to teachers, to not be able to deal with directions or with criticism. And as a result, those kids are often the ones who get into sort of a discipline and punishment spiral. But of course, when you think about those neurological adaptations, that the kind of punishment that we give kids only makes things worse. It just puts them in a mindset where, yes, you actually do have enemies out there, and they're the administrators and teachers in this school, and so you should go to war with them, and you should spend your whole school career, trying to fight with them. And that's, I think, what a lot of kids do. And eventually the school wins, and the kid loses. And so when schools take another approach and they think instead both about what has shaped the sort of forces that have shaped that child's neurology, and then what kind of motivational forces they're really looking for, belonging and competence and autonomy, you deal very differently with those children.
Right. And sticking with that point, you write about one researcher who makes a distinction between being gritty and acting gritty. Can you talk semantics aside about what that distinction actually means?
Sure. So it does sound like a semantic distinction, but I think it's actually a really important one. This is the work of a researcher at the University of Chicago Consortium on Chicago Schools Research named Camille Farrington. And she put out a great report in 2012 called Teaching Adolescents to Become Learners. And in that study, she talked about how some of the research that I've talked about, that we don't actually have any evidence that say we can make a child more gritty, but that doesn't really matter. That this idea of these qualities, these tendencies, these capacities in people, in children, as some kind of inherent trait has actually been really distracting to us, so that we think, okay, we just need to figure out how to measure our kids' grit, how to assess it, how to improve it, how to increase it. Whereas actually what she says is that we don't actually know how to do that, but we know how to create environments in the classroom that get kids to act more gritty. And that's really what we care about. We want them to persevere at this particular problem on this particular day. We want them to get in the habit of sticking with things over a long period of time. And so what's important about that distinction is that you go from saying, well, how do I take this one kid and change him or her, to saying, well, what do I do in my classroom that I can change to have an effect on this child's psychology? And there are two reasons I think that's an important shift. One is it puts the responsibility not on the child to just get these skills, but on us, the adults in that child's life, to shape those environments in a way that helps. And second, it's something we actually know how to do. So you can say to a teacher, you don't have to give them this impossible task of make your kids more gritty. Instead, you can say, think about how you're organizing your classroom. Think about the work that you're assigning. Think about the messages that you're sending and the way that you give criticism and the way you assess your students' growth. And push those in a way that is going to help them develop in these motivational areas.
Right. And in terms of the responsibility for adults, if we know that these skills are important for children's success in the classroom and maybe even outside of the classroom, and we know that they can be in some way instilled through the classroom environment, it seems like we should try to measure them in some way. But there's no standardized test for grit. So how do you go about measuring a teacher's impact? And I guess added to that, should you?
Well, this is actually a huge debate in education right now about there's growing acceptance that these qualities in kids are important, but there is a big debate about whether we should try to assess them. And there are a handful of school districts in California that have introduced this new measure. They're sort of on the vanguard of trying to do this, where they are actually assessing students' non-cognitive skills this year, and they're going to see if that works. And federal law has changed so that now states have to come up with some kind of measure that includes things outside of the regular cognitive realm. So there's a big push to try to do it. I think that the assessments that we have right now and that we're likely to have anytime soon are not appropriate for that kind of high-stakes accountability measure. But in the book and in the article, I read about this economist at Northwestern University named Karabo Jackson, who did a sort of interesting end run around this problem by measuring the impact that teachers had on students' non-cognitive capacities, not by giving students a test, but by looking at the value added by teachers to students in these realms that we don't often think about. Things like attendance, behavior, discipline, GPA, not just in that teacher's class, but in other classes. And he created this proxy measure and looked at 400,000 teachers in 400,000 students in North Carolina, and discovered that there were certain teachers who were just good at this, that if you were assigned to that teacher's class, you were more likely to show up at school, you were less likely to get in trouble, you were more likely to have a good GPA, not just in that teacher's class, but in lots of other classes as well. And that, to me, is a clue of two things. One is that there are certain teachers who know how to do this, who know how to motivate students in ways that make them behave in ways that are going to help them succeed. And second, that there is some way beyond just high-stakes testing and self-assessments to measure the impact of teachers in this harder-to-measure realm.
Yeah. I want to try to bring in the audience for a question. Let's go back here, and please say your name and your organization if you're representing one today.
My name is Nora Morales, and I'm with the Mid-Atlantic Equity Consortium. I want to, first of all, thank you, Mr. Tuff, for bringing this conversation on a national scale. Read your book, loved it.
Thank you.
I also acknowledge the importance of social-emotional learning and these motivational skills. One concern I've had, because we work in the realm of equity and education, is the deficit thinking model that blames kids who are growing up in poverty as being somehow devoid of skills that would make them successful learners. So how would you respond to that criticism about your books? And because I'm sure that was not your intention. So if you could speak a little bit about that, because I do believe that there's a fine balance between acknowledging the type of skills kids need to have to be able to persist and be resilient, and at the same time not framing the conversation as a deficit model.
I think that's a great question, and it's one that I think about a lot, and I agree entirely that it's a tricky balance. I think one of the reasons that that it's hard is because of some of the language that we use about the, words like character and words like grit. If we say that there's evidence that kids who are growing up in adverse circumstances don't have as much character or don't have as much grit, first of all, that's not true. And second, I think it naturally makes people skeptical and upset. At the same time, there is this really clear evidence from neurobiology that when kids grow up in adversity, in difficult circumstances, in poverty, especially in poverty, it has effects on the way that they develop, on their ability to focus on something for a long period of time, to deal well with confrontations, to bounce back from disappointments. There's clear evidence that those things are true. And so, to me, what we need to do, and what I'm trying to do in this new book, is to sort of take the moral questions out of that and not look at those as like character failings, but instead look at those as challenges for the adults in their lives to try to solve, both in terms of trying to improve their early lives, their communities and their homes in ways that make it less likely that they're going to get into school with those sorts of challenges. But then also thinking about what we can do to help kids who arrive with those sorts of tendencies or habits to take on new ones. And to me, that is, that's not deficit thinking. I mean, I think that's sort of the essence of education, that kids don't have enough skills. They don't know enough when they walk in the door. And this work, to me, is just trying to push us toward a new way of thinking about what skills kids need and what kind of help they need in order to get there.
Thank you so much, Paul. Paul will be out in the lobby following this talk, signing copies of his new book, Helping Children Succeed. So you can find him and the book out there.
Thank you.